Have you ever fallen in love with someone whose family seemed perfect on the outside but hid something dark beneath the surface? That was my story, and it nearly cost me everything. My name is Marcus, and what happened to me during my sophomore year at Northwestern University in Chicago changed my life forever. It started with a girl named Emma, the kind of person who lights up a room just by walking into it, but her father, well, he turned out to be the kind of monster you only read about in psychological thrillers. Emma and I met in our organic chemistry lab, where she was my partner for the semester. She had this way of explaining complex molecular structures that made them seem almost poetic. And her laugh when I mixed up my benzene rings was infectious rather than mocking. She wore these vintage cardigans that smelled faintly of vanilla and old books, and she had a habit of tucking her honey blonde hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. I was smitten from day one, but it took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to ask her to study together outside of class. Our first real date was at this little Italian place called Mama Rosa's near campus, the kind of family-owned restaurant where the breadsticks are unlimited and the owner's grandmother's recipes are handwritten on the wall. Emma ordered the butternut squash ravioli and told me about her dream of becoming a pediatric surgeon, how she wanted to specialize in helping children with congenital heart defects. Her eyes lit up when she talked about it, and I found myself opening up about my own plans to go into medical research, specifically studying autoimmune disorders because my younger sister had lupus. Everything about those early days felt magical, like we were living in our own little bubble where nothing could touch us. We would spend hours in the library, not really studying, just talking in whispers about everything and nothing. She introduced me to her favorite coffee shop where they made lavender lattes, and I showed her the jazz club where my roommate played saxophone on Thursday nights. We were that couple that other people rolled their eyes at because we were so obviously wrapped up in each other. But then came the family introductions, and that's when things started to get complicated. Emma had mentioned her father was protective, but I thought she meant the normal kind of protective that any father might feel about his daughter dating someone new. I had no idea what I was walking into. The first sign should have been when she suggested we meet her parents at a restaurant rather than their home. And even then, she seemed nervous in a way I'd never seen before. Dr. William Harrison was a prominent anesthesiologist at Chicago Presbyterian Hospital, one of the most respected medical centers in the Midwest. When I first saw him, I thought he looked like the kind of doctor you'd want taking care of you. Distinguished gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. But when he shook my hand, his grip was unnecessarily firm, almost painful, and his smile never reached his eyes. Throughout that first dinner at the upscale steakhouse he'd chosen, Dr. Harrison interrogated me like I was applying for a top-secret government position. He wanted to know about my family background, my grades, my 5-year plan, my 10-year plan, even my thoughts on the current political climate. His wife, Patricia, tried to soften his questions with nervous laughter and comments about the weather, but you could see she was afraid of him too. The way she flinched slightly when he raised his voice to call the waiter, the way she looked to him for approval before ordering her meal. It all painted a picture I was too naive to fully understand at the time. Emma barely touched her food, pushing her salmon around her plate while shooting me apologetic glances. When her father asked about my scholarship status, implying that I must be at Northwestern on financial aid, I saw her jaw clench. I was on partial academic scholarship, which I'd earned through hard work, but the way he said it made it sound like I was some charity case trying to social climb my way into their family. After that dinner, things got progressively stranger. Emma told me her father had started asking her detailed questions about our dates, wanting to know exactly where we went, what we talked about, how late I kept her out. He began showing up at places we frequented, always with some excuse about being in the neighborhood or meeting a colleague nearby. Once, I caught him sitting in his black Mercedes S-Class outside the movie theater where we were watching a film. When I pointed him out to Emma, she just sighed and said we should leave through the back exit. The surveillance escalated over the next few months. Emma discovered he had hired a private investigator to look into my background, my family, even my social media history going back to middle school. The investigator had contacted my high school teachers, my former employers at the grocery store where I'd worked summers, even my neighbors from the apartment complex where I grew up on the South Side. It was invasive and creepy, but Emma begged me not to confront him about it, saying it would only make things worse. I tried to understand. Really, I did. Emma explained that her father had always been controlling, But it had gotten worse after her older brother died in a swimming accident when he was 12. She was only 8 at the time, and her father had become obsessed with protecting her, with controlling every aspect of her environment to prevent another tragedy. It was sad, and on some level, I felt sorry for him. But his grief didn't give him the right to treat me like a criminal or Emma like a possession. The breaking point came when Dr. Harrison invited me to dinner at their house, what Emma called a peace offering, but felt more like a summons to appear before a king. I spent 2 weeks preparing for that dinner like it was the most important exam of my life. I researched anesthesiology journals, memorized the names of the latest equipment and techniques, even watched YouTube videos of actual procedures so I could speak intelligently about his work. I bought a new shirt and tie, got a haircut, practiced my handshake in the mirror like an idiot. Their house was in Winnetka, one of those North Shore suburbs where the homes look like they belong in architectural magazines, and the lawns are maintained by teams of professionals. It was the kind of neighborhood where I immediately felt out of place, where my 10-year-old Honda Civic looked like an eyesore among the luxury SUVs and European sports cars. The Harrison house was a massive colonial with white columns and black shutters, the kind of place that whispered old money and generational wealth. When Dr. Harrison opened the door that evening, I nearly turned and ran. He was holding a rifle, not pointed at me but cradled in his arms like he'd been cleaning it and just happened to answer the door with it. His expression was completely neutral as he looked me up and down, taking in my carefully chosen outfit, the bottle of aged scotch I'd spent way too much money on, the nervous sweat I could feel forming on my forehead. "Welcome to our home," he said, his voice flat and unwelcoming despite the words. "Please, come in." I stepped inside, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. The foyer was all marble and crystal, with a grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. Family photos lined the walls, but I noticed there were none of Emma's brother, as if he'd been erased from their history. Patricia appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, wearing an apron over her dress and a strained smile on her face. She hugged me briefly, whispering, "It's so good to see you again," before her husband cleared his throat and she stepped back. Dinner was served in a formal dining room that could have seated 20 people easily. We sat at one end of the massive table, Dr. Harrison at the head, naturally, with Patricia to his right and Emma and me on his left. The rifle had disappeared, but I couldn't shake the image of it. Couldn't stop wondering if it was loaded, if he'd been trying to send a message. The food was excellent. Some kind of beef tenderloin with roasted vegetables and a wine reduction that probably required skills I couldn't even imagine. But every bite felt like sawdust in my mouth as Dr. Harrison began his interrogation. He asked about my parents, both hardworking people who had never been to college. He asked about the neighborhood where I grew up, managing to make it sound like a war zone even though it was just a working-class area with good people trying to make better lives for their families. He asked about my future earning potential as a researcher, pointing out that it would never match what Emma was accustomed to. I answered every question as politely and thoroughly as I could, trying to show him that while I might not come from money, I had ambition, intelligence, and most importantly, I genuinely cared about his daughter. Emma tried to redirect the conversation several times, bringing up her own research project or asking her mother about her garden club. But Dr. Harrison always steered it back to dissecting my inadequacies. The moment that changed everything came over dessert. Patricia had made tiramisu from scratch, and we were all pretending to enjoy it when Dr. Harrison started talking about a recent surgery he'd performed. He described in graphic detail how he'd kept a patient at just the right level of sedation, how it was an art form to balance consciousness and unconsciousness, how much power an anesthesiologist really held in their hands. "The human mind is fascinating under anesthesia," he said, his eyes fixed on me. "Some people think patients are completely unconscious, but that's not always true. Sometimes they're aware but paralyzed, able to feel and hear everything but unable to move or speak. It's one of the most terrifying experiences a person can have, being trapped in their own body while someone cuts into them. That must be incredibly rare," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Surgeons and anesthesiologists work hard to prevent that, right?" He smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "Oh, yes, we work very hard to prevent it. But sometimes," he paused, swirling his wine, "sometimes mistakes happen, or sometimes they don't." The way he said it, the deliberate pause, the The way his eyes never left mine, it felt like a threat. Emma's hand found mine under the table and squeezed hard. Her palm was sweaty, and I could feel her trembling slightly. In that moment, I think we both understood that her father wasn't just controlling or overprotective. He was dangerous. After dessert, when Dr. Harrison suggested we retire to his study for brandy, Emma immediately stood up. "Actually, Dad, Marcus has an early class tomorrow. We should get going." Her father's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might insist. But Patricia touched his arm lightly, and he nodded. Of course. We wouldn't want to interfere with Marcus's education. The drive back to campus was silent for the first 10 minutes. Emma stared out the window while I gripped the steering wheel and tried to process what had just happened. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I should have warned you better. I thought maybe this time would be different. Has he threatened other boyfriends?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. She nodded, still not looking at me. "My high school boyfriend, Tyler, broke up with me after Dad showed up at his job and told his manager he was a drug dealer. It wasn't true, obviously, but Tyler worked at a pharmacy, and even the suggestion was enough to cause problems. And there was another guy freshman year who just stopped talking to me after meeting Dad. He wouldn't tell me why. We need to talk to someone about this," I said. "This isn't normal, Emma. This is scary." She finally turned to look at me, and I could see tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. He's not just some crazy father. He's respected, connected, powerful. People believe him. If we try to report him or fight back, he'll destroy us. He's done it before." Those words haunted me over the next few days. He's done it before. What exactly had Dr. William Harrison done? And what was he capable of doing to me? I tried to focus on my classes, my research project on immune cell signaling, my job at the campus bookstore, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every black Mercedes I saw made my heart race. Every time my phone rang with an unknown number, I wondered if it was another private investigator. Emma and I tried to maintain some normalcy, but it was hard. We stopped going to our usual places, started meeting in study rooms deep in the library where her father couldn't accidentally run into us. She was jumpy, constantly looking over her shoulder, apologizing every time her phone buzzed. The stress was taking a toll on both of us, but neither of us wanted to give up on what we had. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I was determined to show Dr. Harrison that I wasn't going anywhere, that I was worthy of his daughter despite his prejudices and control issues. I started working extra shifts at the bookstore, picked up tutoring gigs, even sold some of my belongings to save money. I wanted to prove I could provide for Emma, that I had ambition and drive even if I didn't have a trust fund. I also started working out religiously, hitting the campus gym at 5 in the morning before classes. It wasn't about intimidation. I'm not that kind of guy. But I wanted to feel stronger, more capable of protecting Emma if it came to that. I threw myself into my studies with renewed intensity, pushing my GPA even higher, getting my research published in an undergraduate journal, making connections with professors who could write stellar recommendation letters for graduate school. For 3 weeks, I operated on pure adrenaline and determination. Emma noticed the changes and tried to tell me I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But I was beyond listening. I was going to show her father that I was good enough, that I deserved respect, that love could overcome prejudice and control. I was young and idealistic and completely unprepared for what a man like Dr. Harrison was capable of. The injury happened during a late-night workout session. I was pushing too hard, trying to beat my personal best on the bench press without a spotter, when something in my shoulder gave way. The pain was immediate and intense, shooting down my arm and across my chest. I managed to get the barbell back on the rack, but I knew immediately that something was seriously wrong. I drove myself to the emergency room at Chicago Presbyterian, the irony of going to Dr. Harrison's hospital not lost on me even through the pain. I called Emma on the way, not because I expected her to come, just to let her know where I was and why I might miss our morning study session. She immediately asked which hospital, and when I told her, there was a long pause before she spoke. "My dad's on call tonight," she said, her voice tight with worry. "Let me see what I can do about the wait time. I'll make some calls." I wanted to tell her not to involve her father, but the pain was getting worse and the thought of sitting in the ER waiting room for hours was unbearable, so I just thanked her and said I'd text when I knew more. 15 minutes later, as I was filling out paperwork with my good hand, a nurse appeared and called my name. The waiting room was full of people who'd obviously been there longer than me, and I felt guilty jumping the line. But the pain overrode my sense of fairness. The nurse led me back to a private room, not one of the curtained areas, but an actual room with a door, and told me the doctor would be in shortly to evaluate me for surgery. Surgery? I asked, confused. I thought maybe I'd torn something, but surgery seemed extreme. She checked her chart and nodded. Says here you have a suspected rotator cuff tear with possible labral involvement. Dr. Harrison ordered an expedited MRI to confirm, then straight to surgery if needed. He wants to handle your case personally. My blood ran cold. Dr. Harrison was going to be my anesthesiologist. The man who had all but threatened me over tiramisu was going to be responsible for keeping me unconscious while someone operated on my shoulder. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to deal with the pain rather than put myself in his hands. But then the rational part of my brain kicked in. Surely he wouldn't do anything in his own hospital, with his colleagues around, with records and witnesses. It would be career suicide. Emma arrived just as they were preparing to take me for the MRI. She looked pale and worried, but she tried to smile as she took my good hand. I talked to Mom, she said quietly. She promised to stay during the surgery to make sure everything goes smoothly. I wanted to laugh at the idea that Patricia Harrison could stand up to her husband, but I just squeezed Emma's hand and told her I loved her. The MRI confirmed what they suspected: a complete rotator cuff tear with additional damage that would require immediate surgery to prevent permanent loss of mobility. Dr. Harrison appeared in my room as they were prepping me, looking every inch the competent professional in his surgical scrubs. He didn't acknowledge Emma, who was sitting in the corner, just focused on me with those cold eyes. "Marcus," he said, his voice neutral and clinical, "I'll be handling your anesthesia personally. I want to assure you that despite any personal differences we may have, you'll receive the highest standard of care. I'm a professional, and I take my oath seriously. Do you have any questions about the procedure?" I had a million questions, but none that he would answer honestly. So I just shook my head and let them wheel me into the operating room. The last thing I remember clearly is Dr. Harrison's face above me as he inserted the IV, his expression unreadable behind his surgical mask. "Just count backward from 10, he said, and I started counting, but I only made it to 7 before the world went dark. Except it didn't stay dark. I don't know how long I was actually unconscious before I became aware again, but suddenly I could hear voices, machines beeping, the clink of surgical instruments. I tried to open my eyes, but they felt impossibly heavy, like they were glued shut. I tried to move, to speak, to do anything to indicate I was awake, but my body wouldn't respond. I was completely paralyzed, trapped inside my own flesh while I felt pressure and pulling in my shoulder. The sensation was indescribable. It wasn't exactly pain, the local anesthetic was working on that level, but I could feel everything else. The air on my exposed skin, the tug and pull of tissues being moved, the vibration when they use some kind of tool. But worse than the physical sensations was the absolute terror of being conscious but unable to communicate it. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to thrash, but my body remained perfectly still. I could hear Dr. Harrison's voice among the others, calm and professional as he monitored my vitals. At one point, I heard someone ask if my heart rate seemed elevated, and Dr. Harrison responded that it was within normal parameters, just a typical physiological response to the surgery. He was lying. He had to know I was aware, had to see the signs, but he was choosing to leave me in this nightmare. The surgery lasted about 90 minutes, though it felt like days. 90 minutes of being trapped in my own body, of feeling hands inside my shoulder, of hearing casual conversation between the surgical team about their weekend plans while I silently screamed. Dr. Harrison occasionally made comments about my vitals, always assuring everyone that everything was normal, that I was deeply sedated and feeling nothing. Near the end, as they were closing the incision, I heard him speak directly to me. Or at least I thought I did. His voice was different, quieter, meant only for me. "This is what it feels like to be powerless," he said. "Remember this feeling. It's what happens when you don't know your place." Or maybe I imagined it. Maybe my terrified mind created those words from the general murmur of voices. I'll never know for sure. When I finally woke up properly in the recovery room, I immediately vomited. The nurse attributed it to the anesthesia, said it was a common reaction, but I knew it was from the trauma of what I'd experienced. Emma was there, holding my good hand, tears streaming down her face as she told me everything had gone perfectly, that I'd be back to normal in no time with proper physical therapy. I wanted to tell her what happened, wanted to scream that her father had tortured me, but I couldn't form the words. How do you explain something like that? How do you make someone believe that their father, a respected doctor, had deliberately allowed you to experience one of the most terrifying medical complications possible? So I just squeezed her hand and closed my eyes, pretending to drift back to sleep while my mind raced. The next few days were a blur of pain medication and physical therapy evaluations. I was discharged after 2 days with a sling, a prescription for painkillers, and follow-up appointments scheduled. Dr. Harrison came by my room before I left, playing the part of the concerned physician, checking my chart and asking about my pain levels. He even smiled and told Emma to make sure I followed all the post-operative instructions carefully. But as he was leaving, he paused at the door and looked back at me. Sometimes patients experience unusual sensations during surgery, he said casually. Vivid dreams, false memories, even the sensation of being awake when they weren't. It's all perfectly normal. The mind can play tricks when it's under stress. Then he was gone, leaving me shaking with rage and fear. I didn't speak to anyone for a week after that. I holed up in my dorm room, ignoring Emma's calls and texts, skipping classes, barely eating. My roommate, Jake, tried to check on me, but I just told him I was dealing with pain from the surgery. In reality, the physical pain was manageable. It was the psychological trauma that was destroying me. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that operating table, paralyzed and aware, feeling everything while unable to scream. The nightmares were the worst part. I'd wake up multiple times each night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced I was paralyzed again. Sometimes I'd spend minutes testing each limb, making sure I could move before I could calm down enough to try sleeping again. I knew I was developing PTSD, but I didn't know what to do about it. Who would believe me? And even if they did, what could they do? Finally, Emma showed up at my dorm room and refused to leave until I talked to her. She used her key, the one I'd given her months earlier when everything between us was simple and happy, and found me sitting on my bed in the dark, unshaven and unwashed, looking like a ghost of my former self. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me and took my hand, waiting for me to be ready. I woke up during the surgery, I finally said, my voice hoarse from disuse. I was awake, Emma. I felt everything. I heard everything. And your father knew. He knew and he didn't help me. She was quiet for a long moment, and I braced myself for disbelief, for her to tell me it was just a vivid dream or a side effect of the medication. But instead, she started to cry. I was afraid of this, she whispered. When he insisted on handling your anesthesia personally, I was terrified he might. Her words hit me like a physical blow. You knew he might do this. You knew and you didn't warn me? I tried, she said, her voice breaking. I tried to get him reassigned, but he overruled me, and I couldn't prove anything. Couldn't accuse him without evidence. I'm so sorry, Marcus. I'm so sorry. We held each other and cried, both of us broken by what her father had done. She told me this wasn't the first time she'd suspected him of deliberately allowing anesthesia awareness. There had been whispers among the nursing staff, quickly silenced. There had been a patient years ago who had tried to file a complaint but had been discredited. And there was her mother, who still had nightmares about her cesarean section with Emma's brother, the one who had died. That night, Emma and I made a pact. We were going to expose Dr. William Harrison for what he was. We were going to get justice, not just for me, but for all his victims. It wouldn't be easy, and it would probably destroy Emma's family, but she was adamant that it had to be done. Her father had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and she wasn't going to let him hurt anyone else. The first step was documenting everything. I started a journal, writing down every detail I could remember from the surgery, every word Dr. Harrison had said before and after, every threat and intimidation tactic he'd used. Emma secretly went through her father's home office when he was at work, looking for any evidence of past incidents, any documentation that might support our case. I also started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in medical trauma. She was the first person outside of Emma who truly believed me, who didn't try to minimize or explain away what I'd experienced. She validated my trauma, gave me coping strategies for the PTSD, and most importantly, she offered to document everything for potential legal proceedings. During one of our sessions, Dr. Chen said something that stuck with me. What happened to you is not just medical malpractice, it's assault. He used his medical knowledge and position to deliberately cause you psychological harm. That's a crime, Marcus, and you have every right to pursue justice. Her words gave me the courage to take the next step. I contacted a medical malpractice attorney, James Rodriguez, who had a reputation for taking on difficult cases against powerful doctors. Our first meeting was in his cluttered downtown office, surrounded by law books and case files, the walls covered with newspaper clippings about his victories against corrupt medical professionals. I told him everything, from the first meeting with Dr. Harrison to the surgery and its aftermath. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting down notes, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "This is one of the most disturbing cases I've heard," he finally said. "But it's also going to be one of the hardest to prove. Anesthesia awareness is a known complication, and without concrete evidence that Dr. Harrison deliberately caused it, it's your word against his. And he's a respected physician with an impeccable record on paper." But I heard him acknowledge that my vitals were showing signs of awareness, I insisted. He told the nurse it was normal when it wasn't. James nodded thoughtfully. "That's good, but we need more. We need documentation, witness testimony, a pattern of behavior. One incident, no matter how traumatic, might not be enough to take down someone like Dr. Harrison." That's when I told him about Emma's discovery in her father's office. She had found files on several patients who had complained about their surgical experiences, all of whom had later retracted their complaints or had them dismissed. There were also personal notes about people Dr. Harrison considered problems, including detailed information about Emma's high school boyfriend Tyler and how to discredit him. James's eyes lit up. "Now that's interesting. If we can establish a pattern of retaliatory behavior, we might have something. Can Emma get copies of these files?" I promised to ask her, though I worried about putting her at risk. Her father was already suspicious of our relationship, and if he caught her going through his files, there was no telling what he might do. Meanwhile, I started researching anesthesia awareness on my own. I learned that it happens to about 1 or 2 patients per 1,000, usually due to equipment failure or human error. But I also found forums and support groups for people who had experienced it, and their stories were heartbreakingly similar to mine. The paralysis, the terror, the disbelief from medical professionals afterward, the lasting psychological trauma. On one of these forums, I found a post from someone in Chicago who had experienced awareness during surgery at Presbyterian Hospital 3 years earlier. The username was SilentScream02, and their description of the experience was eerily familiar. They mentioned feeling like the anesthesiologist had done it on purpose, though they couldn't prove it. I sent them a private message explaining my own experience and asking if they'd be willing to talk. To my surprise, they responded within hours. Their name was Jordan Martinez, and she agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. When I arrived, I found a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and tired eyes, sitting in a corner booth and clutching her coffee cup like a lifeline. "I almost didn't come," she said as I sat down. "I don't talk about what happened anymore. It nearly ruined my life the first time. But when you mentioned Dr. Harrison's name, I knew I had to meet you. He did it to you too, didn't he?" I nodded, and she closed her eyes briefly as if reliving her own nightmare. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew I wasn't crazy or confused. He let me wake up during my appendectomy, and when I tried to report it, he made my life hell." She told me her story, how she'd gone in for routine surgery and woken up paralyzed on the table, able to feel every cut and stitch. How she'd heard Dr. Harrison dismiss the nurse's concerns about her elevated heart rate. How she'd filed a complaint with the hospital, only to have it dismissed after an investigation that seemed designed to discredit her. But that wasn't the worst part. After I complained, she said, weird things started happening. My employer got anonymous tips that I was using drugs. My medical records from other doctors started showing up with errors that made me look like a hypochondriac. I started getting sick all the time with mysterious symptoms that no one could diagnose. It was like he was stalking me through the medical system. Jordan's story confirmed what I was beginning to suspect, that Dr. Harrison didn't just hurt people during surgery. He destroyed anyone who tried to expose him, using his connections and influence to ruin their lives. The man wasn't just a sadistic doctor, he was a predator who had been operating with impunity for years. "Would you be willing to testify about your experience?" I asked. "To help us build a case against him?" She hesitated, fear flickering across her face. "I don't know. Last time I tried to fight him, I lost everything. My job, my health, my sanity. I can't go through that again." I understood her fear, but I also knew we needed her. "You wouldn't be alone this time," I said. "We're building a case with multiple victims, documentation, and a good lawyer. He can't discredit all of us." Jordan promised to think about it, and we exchanged numbers. As she left, she turned back to me with a warning. "Be careful, Marcus. Dr. Harrison doesn't just retaliate, he escalates. If he finds out you're building a case against him, he'll come after you with everything he has." Her warning proved prophetic. Within days of our meeting, strange things started happening. My dorm room was broken into while I was in class, though nothing was stolen. My laptop started acting strangely, as if someone had installed monitoring software. I started receiving anonymous texts with vague threats about knowing my place and respecting my betters. Emma was experiencing harassment too. Her father had become even more controlling, monitoring her phone calls, tracking her movements, threatening to cut off her tuition if she continued seeing me. He'd also started making comments about my recovery, asking pointed questions about whether I was having any psychological issues from the surgery, whether I was taking any medications that might cause paranoia or delusions. We decided Emma should start recording their conversations, using her phone to capture her father's threats and manipulations. It was risky, but we needed evidence of his behavior outside the operating room. The recordings revealed a man who was not just controlling, but genuinely disturbed. Someone who saw himself as above the law and justified in destroying anyone who challenged him. In one recording, Dr. Harrison could be heard telling Emma that I was mentally unstable, that the anesthesia had triggered a psychotic break, and that she needed to distance herself before I became dangerous. When Emma defended me, he responded with barely controlled rage, telling her that if she didn't end our relationship, he would make sure I never got into medical school, never got a job in any hospital, never had a future in healthcare. James, our lawyer, was building a compelling case. He'd found 2 more victims willing to testify, former patients who had experienced awareness under Dr. Harrison's care and faced retaliation when they complained. He'd also discovered that several nurses had filed internal complaints about Dr. Harrison's behavior over the years, all of which had been buried by hospital administration. But Dr. Harrison must have sensed the walls closing in. One evening, as I was walking back to my dorm from the library, a car swerved toward me on the sidewalk. I jumped back just in time, falling hard onto the grass as the black Mercedes sped away. I caught a glimpse of the license plate. It was Dr. Harrison's personal vehicle. I called the police, but without proof that he was driving or that it was intentional rather than an accident, they couldn't do much. The officer took my statement with obvious skepticism, especially when I tried to explain the backstory. A respected doctor trying to run down a college student because of a medical complaint? It sounded like paranoid delusion even to me. That's when Emma and I realized we couldn't wait for the slow wheels of justice to turn. Dr. Harrison was escalating, just as Jordan had warned, and one of us was going to get seriously hurt if we didn't act fast. We decided to go on the offensive, to force his hand in a way that would expose him publicly. Emma came up with the plan. She would invite me to dinner at her house, telling her father it was to announce that we were breaking up, that his pressure had worked. He would be off guard, possibly even celebrating, and might let something slip. I would be recording everything, and Emma would try to get him to talk about what he'd done. It was dangerous, we both knew that. We were essentially walking into the lion's den with nothing but a hidden recorder and hope that Dr. Harrison's arrogance would be his downfall. But we were running out of options, and every day we waited was another day he could hurt someone else. The dinner was scheduled for a Friday evening. I spent the day with James, going over what kinds of statements would be most useful for our case, what questions Emma should try to ask, how to protect ourselves legally while gathering evidence. He wasn't happy about our plan, warning us that we were taking unnecessary risks, but he understood our desperation. I arrived at the Harrison house at 6 o'clock sharp, my phone recording in my chest pocket, a backup recorder in my car just in case. Dr. Harrison answered the door with a smile, the first genuine smile I'd ever seen from him. He actually clapped me on the back as he welcomed me in, like we were old friends rather than predator and prey. Emma played her part perfectly, looking subdued and defeated as she greeted me with a formal handshake rather than our usual hug. Patricia seemed confused by the strange energy, but went along with it, serving dinner with her usual nervous efficiency. The dining room felt different this time, less like a courtroom and more like a victory celebration for Dr. Harrison. As we ate our salmon and asparagus, Dr. Harrison was almost jovial, asking about my recovery, my classes, even my family with what seemed like genuine interest. It was deeply unsettling, this sudden warmth from a man who had tortured me, but I forced myself to play along, to wait for the right moment. That moment came over dessert when Emma cleared her throat and announced that we needed to talk about our relationship. Dr. Harrison leaned forward, trying to hide his eagerness, while Patricia looked worried. I took a deep breath and delivered the lines we'd rehearsed. Dr. Harrison, I said, you were right about us. Emma and I come from different worlds, and I don't want to hold her back from the future she deserves. I've decided to end our relationship and focus on my studies. The satisfaction on his face was sickening. He actually smiled, a genuine warm smile this time, and raised his wine glass in a toast. To wisdom beyond your years, he said. It takes a strong man to recognize his limitations. Emma played her part perfectly, letting a few tears fall while staying silent. Patricia looked between us all, clearly sensing something was off, but not sure what. And then, emboldened by his victory, Dr. Harrison made the mistake we'd been hoping for. You know, Marcus, he said, settling back in his chair, I admire your decision. Not many young men would have the courage to walk away from my daughter. The last one who tried to hang on, well, let's just say he learned his lesson the hard way. What do you mean? I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite my racing heart. Tyler, wasn't it? Emma's high school boyfriend? Dr. Harrison's smile turned cold. Poor Tyler. Such a tragic accident getting hit by that car. They never did find the driver. He took a sip of wine. Of course, if he'd simply accepted that he wasn't right for Emma when I first told him, perhaps he would have been more careful when jogging at dusk. The implication hung in the air like a poison cloud. Patricia had gone very pale, and Emma's hand found mine under the table. I forced myself to stay calm, to push just a little further. That must have been devastating for everyone, I said. Losing someone so young. Dr. Harrison shrugged. Natural selection, he said casually. The weak and the stubborn don't survive. It's true in nature, and it's true in society. Those who don't recognize their place in the hierarchy, well, they face consequences. Like patients who complain about their medical care when they should be grateful. My blood was boiling, but I kept my expression neutral. Speaking of medical care, I said, I've been meaning to thank you for taking such good care of me during my surgery. It was memorable. His eyes sharpened, and for a moment I thought I'd pushed too far. But his arrogance won out. Memorable, he repeated. Yes, I imagine it was. Tell me, Marcus, do you remember anything specific about the surgery? This was it. The moment we'd been waiting for. I met his gaze directly. I remember everything, Dr. Harrison. Every sound, every sensation, every word you said. I remember you telling the nurse my elevated heart rate was normal when you knew I was awake. I remember feeling everything while being completely paralyzed. The room was dead silent. Patricia's hand had flown to her mouth, and Emma was gripping my hand so tight it hurt. Dr. Harrison's face had gone from satisfied to furious in seconds, his mask finally slipping completely. You can't prove anything, he said, his voice low and dangerous. It's your word against mine, and who do you think people will believe? A respected physician or a delusional college student with a history of mental instability? I don't have a history of mental instability, I said calmly. Not yet, he snarled. But that can be arranged. A few words to the right people, a few documented concerns about your behavior, and suddenly you're just another paranoid young man who couldn't handle the stress of surgery. William, Patricia suddenly spoke up, her voice shaking. What are you saying? What did you do? He turned on his wife with a look of such contempt that she physically recoiled. Stay out of this, Patricia. You've never understood what it takes to maintain our position, our reputation. Sometimes examples have to be made. Examples like your wife? I asked, gambling on the information Emma had shared. Is that why Patricia still has nightmares about her cesarean? Because you made an example of her too? The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face had gone white as paper, and her hands were shaking. You told me it was my imagination, she whispered. For 20 years you told me I was being dramatic, that I couldn't have been awake during the surgery. Dr. Harrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This conversation is over. Get out of my house, all of you." But as he turned to leave the room, Emma stood too. "No, Dad," she said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. "We're not going anywhere, and you're going to sit back down and explain why you've been torturing people for years. Why you hurt Mom, why you hurt Marcus, why you probably hurt Tyler, and God knows who else." He whirled on her, his face twisted with rage. "You dare question me? After everything I've done for this family, the sacrifices I've made to give you the life you have?" "What sacrifices?" Emma shot back. "You mean the lives you've ruined? The people you've hurt?" "That's not sacrifice, Dad. That's psychopathy." The words seemed to break something in him. He lunged toward Emma, and I instinctively stepped between them. He grabbed my injured shoulder, squeezing hard enough to make me cry out in pain. Patricia screamed, and Emma was shouting for him to stop, but Dr. Harrison was beyond reason. "You think you've won something here?" he hissed in my face. "You think your little recording will matter? I have connections you can't imagine. I'll destroy you so thoroughly that you'll wish you'd stayed asleep on that operating table." That's when we heard the sirens. Unbeknownst to us, Patricia had called 911 when the confrontation started escalating. Within minutes, police officers were at the door, and the scene they found was damning. Dr. Harrison was still gripping my shoulder, his wife was crying, Emma was trying to pull him off me, and I was obviously in pain from my recent surgery. The officers separated us and took statements. I played them the recording from my phone, which had captured everything from Dr. Harrison's implied confession about Tyler to his physical assault on me. They arrested him on the spot for assault, with the promise that detectives would be investigating the other allegations. As they led him away in handcuffs, Dr. Harrison looked back at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he said. But for the first time since I'd met him, I wasn't afraid. Because I knew the truth, he was the one who was finished. The aftermath was both chaotic and cathartic. News of Dr. Harrison's arrest spread quickly through the medical community and the media. Suddenly, patients were coming forward with their own stories of experiencing awareness during surgery, of being dismissed and discredited when they tried to complain. Nurses who had been silenced by hospital administration felt empowered to speak up about their concerns. The investigation into Tyler's death was reopened when police found evidence in Dr. Harrison's home office, including detailed notes about Tyler's jogging route and a receipt for car repairs dated just days after the hit and run. While they couldn't definitively prove he was the driver, the circumstantial evidence was damning. James Rodriguez, our lawyer, was like a kid in a candy store with all the evidence we'd gathered. The recording from the dinner, combined with testimony from multiple victims and the physical assault charges, gave us a rock-solid case. The medical board fast-tracked their investigation, and Dr. Harrison's license was suspended pending a full hearing. Emma and I spent long nights talking through everything that had happened. She was dealing with the complete destruction of her family. Her father was a monster, her mother was a victim who had been gaslit for decades, and everything she'd believed about her childhood was a lie. But she was also incredibly strong, determined to help other victims and make sure her father never hurt anyone again. Patricia filed for divorce and started seeing a therapist who specialized in domestic abuse survivors. It turned out that Dr. Harrison's control and manipulation extended far beyond what we'd seen. Patricia had been psychologically abused for their entire marriage, made to doubt her own perceptions and memories, isolated from friends and family who might have helped her see the truth. The medical board hearing was brutal but necessary. Victim after victim testified about their experiences, painting a picture of a surgeon who had used his position to torture patients he deemed problematic or inferior. The board was particularly disturbed by evidence that he had targeted patients based on race, social class, and personal vendettas. I testified about my experience in detail, the terror of being paralyzed and aware, the certainty that Dr. Harrison knew exactly what he was doing. Dr. Chen, my therapist, provided expert testimony about the lasting psychological damage of medical trauma. Even some of Dr. Harrison's colleagues testified, admitting they had noticed concerning patterns but had been afraid to speak up. In the end, Dr. Harrison's medical license was permanently revoked. He was banned from practicing medicine anywhere in the United States. The criminal trials took longer, but he was eventually convicted of assault, stalking, and harassment, receiving a sentence of 5 years in prison. The investigation into Tyler's death remained open, with prosecutors building a case for vehicular homicide. The hospital faced its own reckoning, Multiple lawsuits were filed by victims who had been ignored or silenced. The administration was forced to implement new policies for handling patient complaints and protecting whistleblowers. Several administrators who had covered for Dr. Harrison were fired or forced to resign. Through it all, Emma and I stuck together. Our relationship had been forged in trauma, but it emerged stronger. We both changed our career paths. Emma decided to become a patient advocate, working to reform medical systems from within. I switched from pre-med to psychology, inspired by Dr. Chen and determined to help other trauma survivors. We graduated together, moved to a small apartment in Rogers Park, and slowly built a life free from Dr. Harrison's shadow. There were still hard days, nightmares and panic attacks, and moments when the trauma felt overwhelming. But there were good days too. Mornings when we cooked breakfast together, evenings spent studying for our respective graduate programs, weekends exploring the city and remembering why we'd fallen in love in the first place. Jordan Martinez became a friend and ally, working with us to create a support group for medical trauma survivors. What had started as our personal nightmare became a movement for change, pushing hospitals to take patient complaints seriously and holding doctors accountable for abuse of power. Dr. Harrison tried to maintain his innocence throughout the legal proceedings, claiming he was being persecuted by ungrateful patients and a vindictive ex-girlfriend. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his arrogance was his downfall. He had kept meticulous records of his crimes, apparently believing he would never be held accountable. In prison, he was just another inmate, stripped of the power and prestige he had wielded like weapons. I heard through the legal grapevine that he was not adjusting well to being powerless, to being at the mercy of others the way he had made so many patients feel. It wasn't exactly justice. Nothing could undo what he had done, but it was a form of karmic balance. The deepest healing came from Patricia, who reached out to me a year after everything happened. She wanted to apologize, to explain how she had been manipulated into complying with her husband's cruelty. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, she told me about decades of psychological abuse, about being made to feel crazy for her own traumatic memories, about watching her husband destroy people while feeling powerless to stop him. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, tears in her eyes. "I failed you. I failed Emma. I failed everyone who was hurt by him. But I want you to know that I see the truth now, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends." I did forgive her because I understood that she was a victim too. Dr. Harrison had created a world where everyone was either a threat to be destroyed or a tool to be used, and Patricia had survived by becoming the latter. Her courage in finally standing up to him and calling the police that night had been the turning point that saved us all. Emma and Patricia slowly rebuilt their relationship, founded on honesty rather than fear. Patricia sold the house in Winnetka and moved to a modest apartment in the city, starting over at 62 with a kind of freedom she'd never known. She volunteered at a women's shelter, using her experience to help other abuse survivors recognize the signs of coercive control. As for Tyler, Emma's high school boyfriend, the case remained officially unsolved. But a witness came forward after Dr. Harrison's arrest, saying they had seen a black Mercedes in the area that night, driving erratically. It wasn't enough for a conviction, but it was enough for closure. Tyler's parents finally had some measure of justice, knowing that the man responsible was behind bars for other crimes. The ripple effects of exposing Dr. Harrison continued for years. Medical schools started including training on recognizing and preventing anesthesia awareness. Hospitals implemented better systems for reporting concerns about colleagues. Patient advocacy groups gained more power and recognition. It wasn't a perfect system. There would always be those who abused their power, but it was better. Emma and I got married in a small ceremony in Lincoln Park, surrounded by friends who had become our chosen family. Jordan was a bridesmaid, Dr. Chen attended as a guest, and James Rodriguez gave a toast about the power of truth over intimidation. Patricia walked Emma down the aisle, both of them crying but smiling, finally free from the shadow of the man who had controlled their lives. Our wedding rings were simple silver bands, nothing fancy or expensive. But they meant everything to us, symbols of a love that had survived the worst kind of test. During our vows, I promised Emma that I would never let fear silence me again, and she promised to always believe in the power of speaking truth, no matter how difficult. We honeymooned in Michigan, at a cabin by a lake where no one knew our story. For a week, we were just another young couple, hiking and swimming and planning our future. We talked about children someday, about raising them with honesty and courage, about teaching them to stand up to bullies no matter how powerful they might seem. The nightmares faded eventually, though they never disappeared entirely. Sometimes I still woke up feeling paralyzed, my heart racing as I tested each limb to make sure I could move. But Emma was always there, grounding me in the present, reminding me that I had survived and that Dr. Harrison could never hurt us again. In my graduate psychology program, I specialized in trauma therapy, focusing on medical PTSD. My thesis was on the psychological impact of anesthesia awareness and the importance of believing patient experiences. It was published in several journals and became a resource for both medical professionals and patients. Emma excelled in her patient advocacy program, eventually landing a job with a national organization working to reform medical complaint procedures. She traveled the country, speaking at hospitals and medical schools, sharing our story and pushing for systemic change. Her father had tried to silence voices like mine, but Emma amplified them. We stayed in Chicago, the city where our nightmare had happened, but also where we had found justice and built our life together. Sometimes we'd pass Presbyterian Hospital and I'd feel a flutter of the old fear, but it was always followed by a sense of triumph. That building no longer held power over me. Dr. Harrison served his full sentence, his appeals rejected at every level. I heard he spent his time in prison writing angry letters to medical journals, claiming he was a victim of a conspiracy. No one published them. When he was released, he was a broken man, banned from medicine, divorced, estranged from his daughter, and notorious in the worst way. He tried to contact me once, sending a letter through his lawyer. I didn't open it. James advised me to return it unopened to maintain the no-contact order that was part of his release conditions. I didn't need to read his words to know what they contained, either more threats or self-pitying justifications. Either way, I had no interest. The most meaningful moment came 5 years after everything happened. I was working as a licensed therapist by then, specializing in medical trauma. A new client came to see me, referred by her doctor after she experienced anesthesia awareness during surgery. She was terrified, convinced no one would believe her, sure she was going crazy. I listened to her story, validated her experience, and then shared my own. The relief on her face when she realized she wasn't alone, that someone understood and believed her, was profound. In that moment, I understood why I had gone through everything, so I could help others navigate the same trauma and find their way back to wholeness. Emma was pregnant with our first child by then, and we often talked about how to protect our children while still raising them to be brave. We decided that the best protection was truth, teaching them to recognize manipulation, to trust their instincts, and to speak up when something was wrong, no matter who was doing it. We named our daughter Sarah, after Dr. Chen, the therapist who had believed me when I needed it most. As I held her for the first time, I thought about the future we were giving her, one where she would never have to stay silent to stay safe, where she would know that her voice mattered and her experiences were valid. The support group Jordan and I had started grew into a national network, connecting medical trauma survivors across the country. We held annual conferences, bringing together patients, healthcare providers, and advocates to share stories and strategies for change. Dr. Harrison had tried to isolate and silence his victims, but instead, he had inadvertently created a community. Looking back now, from the safety of a life rebuilt, I can see how that terrible experience shaped everything that came after. The trauma was real, the impact lasting, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was a dark chapter that led to brighter ones, a test that revealed strength I didn't know I had. Sometimes young medical students reach out to me, having heard about the case, wanting to understand how to be better doctors. I always tell them the same thing, that power without compassion is dangerous, that patients are people, not problems, and that the ability to heal comes with the responsibility to first do no harm. Emma and I still go to Mama Rosa's, the little Italian restaurant where we had our first date. The breadsticks are still unlimited, the owner's grandmother's recipes still handwritten on the wall. We sit in the same booth when we can, holding hands across the table, grateful for how far we've come from those innocent kids who had no idea what they were about to face. The scar on my shoulder has faded to a thin white line, barely visible unless you know to look for it. It's a reminder, but not of victimhood. It's a reminder of survival, of the power of truth, of the importance of standing up to those who abuse their authority. It's a reminder that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to the most important work. Our story made national news eventually, featured in medical journals and true crime podcasts, analyzed in ethics classes and psychology textbooks. But for Emma and me, it's simply our story, the unlikely path that brought us together and made us who we are. We don't dwell on it, but we don't hide from it either. When people ask how we stayed together through something so traumatic, I tell them it wasn't easy. There were times when being together was a constant reminder of the worst period of our lives. But there were more times when being together reminded us that we had survived, that love and truth had triumphed over control and cruelty. Dr. William Harrison had tried to destroy me because he saw me as unworthy of his daughter, because I didn't fit into his narrow view of who belonged in his family's life. He had failed spectacularly, not just in breaking us apart, but in every way that mattered. His legacy wasn't one of medical excellence, but of cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when doctors forget their oath to do no harm. The medical community learned from his example, implementing safeguards and training to prevent future abuses. Young doctors learned about the case in their ethics classes, discussing how someone so brilliant could become so cruel, how to recognize the warning signs in themselves and their colleagues. It was a painful but necessary evolution. Emma and I often reflect on how different our lives might have been if Dr. Harrison had simply been an overprotective father. Difficult, but not dangerous. We might have had a simpler path, free from trauma and legal battles. But we also might not have found our purpose, might not have helped all the people we've been able to help because of what we experienced. Our daughter, Sarah, is 5 now, bright and curious and fearless in the way children should be. She knows that mommy helps people who have been hurt and daddy helps people who are scared. She doesn't know the details of our story yet. She's too young for that wait. But someday we'll tell her when she's ready to understand. We'll tell her about courage and consequences, about speaking truth to power, about how sometimes the worst people hide behind the most respectable facades. We'll tell her that her grandfather was a cautionary tale, but that his cruelty led to changes that protect people like us. Most importantly, we'll tell her that she comes from a line of survivors, people who refuse to be silenced. The nightmares are rare now, coming only during times of particular stress. When they do come, I have tools to handle them, breathing exercises, grounding techniques, and the solid presence of Emma beside me. The body remembers trauma, but it also remembers healing. It remembers that we survived, that we won, that we're safe now. Every year on the anniversary of my surgery, Emma and I light a candle for all of Dr. Harrison's victims, known and unknown. We don't do it for him. He doesn't deserve our thoughts, but for them, for their pain and their courage, for the ones who spoke up and the ones who couldn't. It's a small ritual, but it matters to us. I sometimes wonder what happened to Dr. Harrison after his release from prison. I know he's not allowed to practice medicine, not allowed to contact us, not allowed near the hospital where he once wielded so much power. I imagine him alone and bitter, stripped of everything he valued. It's not a happy thought, but it's a just one. The truth is, I don't think about him much anymore. He occupied so much space in our lives for so long, but now he's just a footnote, a bad chapter in a much longer and better story. Emma and I have built a life filled with purpose and love, surrounded by people who value truth over power, compassion over control. When young people contact me, having experienced their own medical trauma, I always tell them the same thing that Dr. Chen told me all those years ago. Your experience is real, your pain is valid, and you deserve to be believed. It's a simple message, but for someone who's been gaslit and dismissed, it can be life-saving. The medical system isn't perfect. It never will be, but it's better than it was. There are more safeguards, more accountability, more recognition that patients are partners in their care rather than passive recipients. Dr. Harrison's legacy, the one he never intended, was to catalyze changes that protect vulnerable patients from predatory doctors. Emma's work in patient advocacy has helped establish new protocols in hospitals across the country. She's testified before Congress about the importance of independent oversight in medical settings. She's written guidelines that are now used in medical schools to teach future doctors about the power dynamics in healthcare. Her father tried to silence voices, but she became a megaphone for them. My practice has grown over the years, specializing in helping people recover from medical trauma and institutional betrayal. Every client who walks through my door carries their own story of being failed by systems meant to help them. I hold space for their pain while helping them find their way back to trust, both in themselves and eventually in seeking necessary medical care. We've built a good life, Emma and I. We have a house now, nothing as grand as her childhood home, but filled with warmth and laughter. Sarah has a baby brother, Marcus Jr., whom we call MJ. Our walls are covered with photos of our chosen family, the survivors and advocates and allies who helped us through our darkest time and celebrate with us now. Sometimes I run my hand over the scar on my shoulder, feeling the raised line of tissue that marks where everything changed. It's not a source of pain anymore, just a part of my history. Like the gray starting to appear in my hair or the laugh lines around Emma's eyes. We're marked by our experiences, but not defined by them. The young couple who fell in love over organic chemistry homework feels like a lifetime ago, innocent and unaware of what was coming. But in some ways, we're still them, still choosing each other every day, still believing that love is stronger than fear and truth more powerful than intimidation. Dr. Harrison tried to break us, but we became unbreakable. Our story isn't unique in its broad strokes. Many people have faced abuse from those in power. Many have fought for justice against overwhelming odds. What makes it worth telling is the hope it offers. Proof that predators can be stopped, that victims can become survivors, that love can flourish even in the shadow of trauma. When I think about that night at the operating table, paralyzed and terrified while Dr. Harrison allowed me to suffer, I no longer feel like a victim. I feel like someone who survived something terrible and used it to help others. The pain was real. The trauma was devastating, but it led to purpose and connection and a life I couldn't have imagined. Emma and I joke sometimes that we had the worst meet the parent story in history. But we also had one of the best outcomes. Not just justice for ourselves, but changes that protect others. We took our pain and transformed it into purpose. Our trauma into advocacy. Our love into a force for change. As I finish writing this, Sarah's playing in the backyard while Emma pushes MJ on the swing she insisted on installing herself. The sound of their laughter drifts through the window, a reminder of everything good that came from something terrible. We're a family forged in fire but defined by love. Proof that sometimes the worst people in our lives inadvertently lead us to our best selves. Dr. William Harrison wanted to destroy me because he didn't think I was good enough for his daughter. In trying to break us apart, he brought us closer together. In trying to silence me, he gave me a voice that has helped hundreds of others. In trying to maintain his power, he lost everything. There's a poetic justice in that, a reminder that cruelty ultimately consumes those who wield it. The sun is setting now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Emma calls me to join them outside, and I close my laptop, leaving the past in the past where it belongs. Our story has been told, our truth shared, our purpose found. Now it's time to live, to laugh, to love, to continue building a life that Dr. Harrison could never have imagined or destroyed. This is our story, mine and Emma's, but it's also the story of everyone who has been failed by those meant to help them. Everyone who has spoken truth despite threats. Everyone who has chosen love over fear. It's a story of survival and justice, of trauma and healing, of a love that refused to be broken by one man's cruelty. And in the end, that's what matters most. Not the pain we endured, but the strength we found. Not the cruelty we faced, but the compassion we chose. Not the man who tried to destroy us, but the life we built in spite of him. Dr. William Harrison is a cautionary tale, but we, Emma and I, and all the survivors who found their voices, were the happy ending he never saw coming.